I'm Deirdre Mulligan. I'm a professor at the School of Information, and have helped to put together the UC Berkeley Executive Fellows in Applied Technology Policy Program. And I'm delighted to kick off our first public event of Tech Policy Week here on the Berkeley campus with this fabulous panel talking about bigger, better ambitions for AI. With us, we have Dr. Arati Prabhakar, who was who was President Biden's Science and Technology Advisor, as well as the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And she is joined today by Anima Anukumar from Caltech, who I believe is a professor. And what was that?
Indeed.
Indeed. And Vivek Viswanathan from Stanford, who was also a colleague at the White House. And I couldn't think of a better group of people to kick off this conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Vivek as our moderator. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Deirdre. It's wonderful to be here and just an incredible set of sessions this afternoon, and especially to be here with both of you. And Arati, I'll start with you. You were President Biden's Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy for several years. You've had leading roles at DARPA. You've seen so many different iterations of the federal scientific enterprise. Clearly, everyone in this room recognizes that we're in difficult times right now. And so I think I'll start with a very general question of, as President Biden's science advisor, country, you spoke to so many different audiences. Did you have a sense that the people you spoke with outside the core scientific community had a sense of what federal R&D did and how it undergirded so many of these advancements? Or do you have a sense that there's still a lot of education that you think we need to do?
It's great to be here with both of you. This is fantastic. I think we're going to have a good conversation. When you talk to people across the country about what they value, it is their health, their family's health, it's economic opportunity, it's America's position in the world. And those are the things that we make public investments in research and development for. And so at that level, I think people do understand. And I think many people understand, for example, that cancer cures aren't possible without public research. And some people understand that the information revolution had its seeds in public research. And I think very many people think about the fact that when they take a sip of water and don't have to worry about whether it's clean, that too traces back to the research that then led to the regulations that led to clean water. So, we are in a crisis in this country. And I find every day that the things I've taken for granted in my entire adult life, I can no longer take for granted. And one of the many things that we can't take for granted is our federal investment that has made this the best system for science, technology, and innovation that the world has ever seen. We have to stand up for it. We have to make sure people understand what it means in their lives. And to the point of this panel, part of why I'm both so excited about what we're going to be able to do with AI, far beyond the sort of practical, mundane things that are happening now. And yet that's what's at stake if we don't get back on track as a country.
Absolutely. And I know both of you have been thinking and researching and talking about AI well before 2022, when everyone assumes AI was invented. And so, Nima, I thought I would start with you. You've been doing this research for years and years at Caltech, in academia. You've worked in industry. What do you think are the real roots that people who kind of look at AI as LLMs, ChatGPT, what are a lot of the audience missing that they should really want to know?
Yeah, I mean, to me, when I was beginning grad school, that was, almost more than 2 decades ago now, right? AI was considered science fiction. That was not a career that anybody aspired for. And so it's thanks to federal funding, it's thanks to America being this open society where I could come from India, do my grad school here, pursue all of those theoretical foundations for years and years, right? I mean, you hope something will work out, but that's what research is. It's high risk, high reward. And that's what was enabled. All the roots were in academia. And of course, way before me, since the 60s, 70s, if not earlier. People had all of these theories of what learning is, what neural networks are. We went through an AI winter in the 80s because promises were made, but the compute and the data was just not available. And then, was really the creation of data sets, starting with, of course, Professor Fei-Fei Li as one of the students at Caltech when she started creating these data sets in Pietro Perona's group, and then went on to create ImageNet. And, and that was also possible because of the creation of internet itself, right? You could, for the first time, get all of this data together. And then at the same time, we had GPUs from NVIDIA and others that was beginning to think about not just general purpose computing, but accelerated computing, doing things in parallel, matrix multiplications that start with the roots in linear algebra going back several decades. So all of these underpinning of math is what enabled AI. To me, AI is this trinity of data, compute, and neural network algorithms. So all this came together beautifully, and that itself has been happening since the 2010s, right? The scaling of deep learning, and that's what got me to be part of industrial labs. I started the cloud AI group at Amazon Web Services, then went to NVIDIA, saw that whole scaling of language models, and also a lot of physical AI, which we can touch upon later. So to me, that's where we are still early in this journey about AI, and this is just the AI can do, and we can do that for so many domains.
That's amazing to know, and especially what you say about how so many different forces have to come together in any area of science to create this level of progress. So we all know there's so much excitement about AI. There's also a lot of hype, as we see with any given technology. So on the one hand, we see these claims that maybe we will be a country of geniuses in a data center within the next 18 months. On the other, there's a sense even within the last couple of weeks or months that has the progress stalled. Have some of these LLMs, for example, not been quite as advanced as people hoped. On yet the other hand, AI has already won a Nobel Prize for the researchers behind it. So what do you, before we go into some of these areas, and I know Arati, you've just discussed in the workshop what we see in education, what we see in health, what we see in weather forecasting. What would you say generally for all of us who see all the hype, we see all the breathless columns, and we read the naysayers responding to those columns? What is your take on this general moment that we're in? And Arti, I'll start with you.
You were looking at Anima, so I was like, great, I get to hear what she's going to say first. Well, let's see. So much to say. Look, I think the most straightforward way to think about AI is I do think it is the most powerful technology of our times. The reason I think that is because of its breadth. And it comes right back to what you said, Anima, because we live in such a data-rich world, and this is a technology that instead of programming a computer to tell it what to do, you train it on data. And we have so many kinds of data, scientific data and sensor data and financial data and administrative data. And every time you click anything online, that's data. And all of that is being turned into AI models to do all kinds of amazing things. As you said, that's been going on for a couple of decades now. When I was director at DARPA in 2012 to 17, we were using AI, the machine learning, this generation of AI, in so many astonishing, amazing ways. Just one example that no one even thinks about is using AI to understand what's happening in the radio spectrum, so you can see how it's being used, so that you can optimize how you transmit your bits and get much more capacity in a narrow, in a fixed amount of bandwidth, like all kinds of uses. And in that time period, now a decade ago, we used to say, gee, it doesn't really seem to have done for natural language processing what you sort of would hope would be a big breakthrough. And it's because we hadn't yet, no one had done as much compute and as much data as you need. So now everyone's agog because of large language models. They talk to us, and that's why it's gotten so much attention. It's super interesting, powerful, broad in itself. But then when you back up and think about how many other kinds of data can build, how many other kinds of AI systems, some have been built and are in our world, some have yet to be built and can really be transformative in the future. So I do think it's the most powerful technology of our times for all of those reasons. And Yes, there's way too much hype. And in particular, look, I live in downtown Palo Alto, and for 100 miles in any direction from where I live, everyone believes that they will single-handedly cause all those revolutions to happen. And that's, like it's sort of adorable. And of course, we need all of that. But it's just nothing. We do big things in this country, but every single one of them takes the public sector and the private sector playing their roles. And while our private sector is investing, billions and trillions in this area, and no doubt will go find all the business opportunities, I have no question about that. The market will sort all of that out. But our government right now is being meek and timid about managing AI's downside risks, and it is not investing to do its role to seize the research that's happening, the amazing things that people like Anima and others are doing, and turn it into the AI applications that will not just help us be more efficient for business. That's fine. Let's make sure we do it right, for sure. But we can do so many more interesting things that actually change people's lives. And that's the part I want to make sure that we get to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so, to me, AI becomes a catch-all for so many things, right? So just to set the stage, I mean, AI is not just language models. Language models are trained on text data, but now we have data of all kinds because, as Arti said, first it was computer vision. We were trying to recognize what was in images. That's what was started with ImageNet as the contest with that large-scale, image data set. And so, so we have all these different modalities of data, right, on which AI can be done. But also there is the notion of discriminative versus generative AI. So, if you're doing face recognition, when you go through the airport or any kind of such face recognition system, it's just trying to distinguish, is the face here, is it belonging to the person in the, in the database or not? So it's one that is distinguishing or categorizing versus in generative AI, if you're asking ChatGPT to generate text or an image, it's generating from scratch, right? Of course, it's based on all the data it has seen before, but the sample that it is having generation is completely new. And so that's why we call generative AI. And that was the surprise because, we took more than a decade to just get AI to distinguish or discriminate between different samples. And now here we are generating something new. And, like Richard Feynman, like there's one of his sayings where he says that intelligence is about creation, right? Being able to create something new. And that's why it has sparked this widespread, excitement, a lot of hype, a lot of also worry. I mean, is AI conscious? Is AI going to take over our world? So there's all of this because of this ability to generate. But that's still, to me, grounded in hard science because, how you come up with this generation is based on data, and the scale is what made this possible. And I say that we are still early in this journey because think about AI being able to create new drugs, come up with new medical devices, come up with new rockets. Again, we are starting to see sparks of it, but all of that foundation requires physics itself, that knowledge of physics, that knowledge of full understanding of the world around us. And that journey is still early. And so to me, yes, there is hype, but all of that hype shouldn't be focused solely on language models.
Can I tag on to that? First of all, I love all of this. And I was at Caltech for graduate school. And so when you talk about physics, I'm like, oh, yes, Caltech physics. I want to come back to the generative era of AI because in the fall of 2022, the world had this astonishing moment and because of generative AI and ChatGPT rolls out. And I think for a lot of people, it felt like the machines had come to life. The fact of the matter is, it's about a decade ago that Microsoft came up with a chatbot, Tay, and they rolled it out. And in about a nanosecond, people got it to say the most vile Nazi supporting things that the world has ever seen, which wasn't normalized a decade ago, and they considered it abhorrent and they pulled it down. So really all that happened is finally AI models can generate text that doesn't make you immediately want to throw up. And so now it might be useful for something. But I think it was because it's speaking our language, people are having almost a religious experience around it. And it's really just a statistical estimate of something that might be an appropriate response that now finally doesn't suck, basically, right?
Fascinating. And it reminds me actually of, speaking of Richard Feynman, I know one of the many, many things he's known for is he always said, if you want to really understand something, you teach it to somebody else, and then you can test your understanding that way. And I think Arati had a unique example of that because she was the person who showed the president of the United States ChatGPT when it came out at the end of 2022, early 2023. And one of the things I remember is we were all asking her, well, can we see, what the output is, what you're going to show him? And she and her chief staff aside said, well, because of the statistical process, I actually can't tell you for sure what is going to come out when we put in the prompts because it's different every single time. But you were able to walk the president through that and what it meant. And then there were still another 2 years that you had in the White House. And I'm curious for you, I remember right away you were thinking about this, what became the AI aspirations agenda. How can we use this for good? And what were the categories that you were most excited even 3 years ago? And how has that evolved over time? And looking forward, I know you spoke a little bit about this in the workshop, but of all these many things, like you said, AI is everything. What are the 1 or 2 areas where 10 to 15 years from now, you would take a bet, this is where we will see the most progress?
That's great. I love to think about that. First of all, I just want to say it's really fun to tell the staffers to the president that you're going to show him something and you can't tell them what it's going to say. Like it's all that was a delightful moment. So what happened in that meeting in the Oval Office, that kicked off a set of policy actions that we and several of the other fellows here got to be part of. And it led to some very practical improvements in Americans' daily lives about how they receive healthcare that might have AI decision-making in it and how they are treated when their mortgage application gets turned down by a bank that's using an AI model. So some really practical, important things came out of it. People like Eric Heisen made sure that our Department of Homeland Security was using it in safe and appropriate, but really effective ways. A lot of good things happened. In 2024, I started thinking about the fact that we still had a ton more work to do to get AI right, to make sure that we were managing the risks and the downsides. But I started thinking about, the fun of getting to do research is that you get to peer into what the future might look like. And there were such dazzling possibilities for AI technology if you got beyond just the business opportunities that all the companies were investing in and were talking about and were hopped up about. And I wanted to make sure that we didn't overlook those because ultimately, I think it doesn't really change people's lives when you just make business processes more efficient. My favorite example is that the first well-documented example of a business productivity enhancement in a real company is in a paper by Eric Brynjolfsson and co-authors. They found a 14% improvement in productivity for customer service in a real world application in a company. So, if I'm the CFO of a company and one of my cost centers has a 14% productivity enhancement, this is going to make my heart sing. This is like I'm having a very good day. Have you had a better customer service experience from anyone? And is there any chance that those customer service reps are actually getting paid more because they're more productive? Like I'd hope so, but I'm not really sure. So of course it's good if we're having productivity enhancements, but I just don't really care that much. Like it's not changing my life. And so the point of our AI aspirations work at the White House was to go find the big visions for AI and then really ask, what would it take not just to think about them, not just to do the research that shows they're possible, but to realize them for people so that these transformations actually start happening in people's lives. And I found 7 amazing people across government. Each of them identified a vision and each laid out what would it take to get there. And if you're very good at Googling, you can find the archived versions of AI aspirations. Reach out and I can give you the materials if you want, because they're really exciting pictures. I have chosen 3 of them now to focus on in my work under this fellowship because I think they're great examples of the broader. I mean, there's much more that could be done. But just to give you 3 quick examples, one is the idea that we could, instead of taking decades to generate a new medicine for an existing condition, the prospect is starting to become visible. You can imagine a future where we could do that in months rather than decades. I mean, it's unbelievable to think about. But the problem is that if you just use AI to train on biological and clinical data and generate a molecule, you just have a molecule. It's not a medicine until you go through clinical trials and FDA approval. So the real holy grail question is, what would it take for AI technology to change clinical trials and the approval process in a way that we would really believe in it, that it would both improve and speed up those processes? Those are fundamentally public responsibilities. So in addition to the deep research, the investment in the compute it's going to take to do that deep research, the broader university community that's going to have to be part of that, in addition to DeepMind and other companies, that all has to happen, and FDA change at FDA over time has to happen. So that's, I think, one really important example. A very different one is about changing educational outcomes for our kids. I'm sure many of you have seen what AI-empowered edtech tools look like, and they are very, very exciting. But if they don't do, edtech tools didn't close educational gaps for our kids, despite telling me for 30 years, my hair was black when they first told me that was going to happen, didn't happen. So it doesn't matter if the tools get better if they still aren't reaching every kid in every classroom. So there's a huge reach issue there. And then weather forecasting, which Anima knows more about that than I like to call Anima Our Lady of AI for Science, because I think she's amazing on this stuff. So, but that's another one that really, she should talk about that. But I just want to say there's a public role in addition to what important things private companies are doing.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. To me, what has happened with weather forecasting, and I'm happy to talk about it, is something that for the broader sciences is really a great blueprint, right? Because, I see the parallels between protein folding and weather forecasting, because the one common thing with both of them is the availability of open, well-curated data set and enough data so that you can train models that can really have broad implications. So in the case of weather model, the ECMWF, which is the European Agency for Global Weather Forecasting, they have been collecting for more than 40-year data, but also they've curated it, meaning it's not just the raw satellite images, but one that is assimilated with physics, right? So there's the knowledge of how, like the physics of, for instance, there is energy conservation, right? There is thermal effects that have like physics equations. So all of that is kind of implicitly incorporated into that data set. And that data set has just been sitting there. Anybody can go download this. And so here we were in 2021, I had been starting to work on AI for science in a broader way. Like, instead of like going to every single faculty at Caltech and trying to ask what can AI do? And by the way, they're always very skeptical because they're like, they have high standards, if you know how Caltech is. And they're like, oh, I don't have the data, or I don't have I have the knowledge of physics. How can you incorporate that? And so we came up with this method called neural operators that can broadly solve any partial differential equation system. So weather is one example of that, because what is weather? It's really trying to tell you based on physics, how will the wind move? What is the direction through fluid dynamics? How does the thermal heating effects happen? So that was, to me, a great use case for what neural operators could do. But again, there was a lot of pushback from core weather scientists who felt like, oh, this is too difficult. Like what you really need is a supercomputer. Weather forecasting done traditionally, requires these big supercomputers, and it requires solving all these equations of physics each time, right? So there's no learning. Each time it's solved brute force, and then you try to guess what the weather happens tomorrow. And so given this state of things, we were like, I think one benefit of AI is you can just go try this. So we were able to take the data set because it's open source. We were like, let's just see. And we had, of course, collaboration with weather scientists. So at that time, I was at NVIDIA. I have collaborators at Caltech, as well as the Berkeley lab here. I mean, amazing scientists. And we had the Perlmutter supercomputer in addition to the NVIDIA compute, right? So again, a great example of public-private partnership coming together. And, and we trained this model. It required more computing than what would be typically available to, say, a single researcher or in academia. But to everyone's surprise, even our first attempt became very competitive. So it was the same accuracy as weather models while being tens of thousands of times faster. Meaning what would take this big supercomputer could now be run on a local desktop that you may have at home, right? And we were the first to open source this model. It's permissively open source, so even startups, companies, everybody could build on it. So to me, this is the democratization of weather models that really created everybody to say, okay, now I can do local weather because I have my own sensors. There are companies sending balloons and saying, let me collect more data. And so it's creating this now revolution in weather forecasting because everybody can now, have at their own hands the weather model. And to me, one important aspect of what made this possible in addition is how neural operators can take those fine scales features. So one difference from language models is in language, you have a fixed vocabulary, meaning you know all the words that can occur. So you just have to guess which of the possible words is occurring. But weather is not the same as language, right? So weather is happening everywhere. And even if you zoom in and go to microscopic levels, my weather just keeps happening. And that's the beauty of the natural world around us. It just happens in all scales. And what we do with neural operators is to be able to glean all of those scales together. So you can zoom in and out as you require. And that is really necessary for scientific discovery, scientific modeling. So think of like clouds, like how the particles there, you have to zoom in to get the details. So those abilities are what we provide with neural operators. So having that algorithmic aspect also built in, building in the knowledge that the world is a globe, meaning it kind of goes around, right? Seems very silly, but adding that makes a big difference because now you can go from just predicting the weather tomorrow to predicting it for the next few months to even years and doing climate change predictions. So saying several decades from now, what can happen to our climate? All of this is done with one model, right? Which is to me, which was very surprising to researchers traditionally because they had a different model for climate and a different model for weather. So the immediate weather has a different calculations altogether than trying to do climate in several decades. And I was like, there's only one Earth. So as somebody who's an outsider, I was like, this is just amazing to me. But that's because they're forced to do all these approximations, whereas with AI, it kind of internally figures out what is the right way to kind of model this problem, taking in all the data. And so we're seeing this, amazing impact, not only in terms of making this cheaper and faster with AI, but really having that impact in extreme weather event, right? So, and we see that now with our latest models, what we're able to do, again, in collaboration with the Berkeley lab here, we can now run much larger statistical ensembles. So if you think about hurricane, if you think about storm, all of this is increasing with climate change. What is really difficult there is to come up with the risk assessment. Is the hurricane really going to hit Florida here in this specific region? Because making evacuation judgments, all of this is about risks. And these are called tail events because these are rare. I mean, you don't see a lot of it in the data that we trained on. So you would think, oh, this is so difficult for AI. But surprisingly, it turns out to be not only good at being able to get at these extreme weather events, we can also run lots of scenarios, meaning, starting in the Caribbean a few weeks before the hurricane, can I perturb and change the conditions and see how the hurricane will go forward? So I can be having early warnings, I can be better prepared because AI makes it so much cheaper to do very extensive scenario generation with AI, large statistical ensembles. So you can really calibrate and make sure you get the right risk assessment to make these judgments about extreme weather events.
Fascinating to know. And I know Arti mentioned, one of the virtues of technology, you get to peer into the future. And I think that's something clearly you get to do from your perch. And as you mentioned, it's so much more than LLMs, what's going on here. So you just described to us the story of how weather forecasting has, even in the last couple of years, changed so much and will continue to do so. And I think about how for decision makers, like you mentioned, who are thinking whether to impose an evacuation order on a community, this type of data will literally save lives right now. What are, if you had to pick one or two others, I'm sure you're looking at so many things, but like I asked Arthi, if you had to make a wager on 10 years from now, look at the progress we've made on this set of issues, what are one or two other places where you would look?
I mean, I would pick like the broad aspect of AI for scientific discovery, right? So if you think about language models, what they're already helping is coming up with ideas, saying, oh, maybe, this drug may be a better candidate, or, I looked this up in the scientific literature, maybe this part of the proof could be solved by having this kind of tactic, as an example. But these are all at the level of ideas, right? Which is great. I mean, there are more ideas being given by AI, but lots of scientists have ideas too. But the real bottleneck is being able to experiment in the physical world, right? Either go collect observations in an environment or go to the lab, build very expensive equipment, and then try to do experiments. So you can't afford to do lots of experiments. And that's why I feel science as a whole has become much more risk averse, a lot of funding cuts, everything. So you'd rather, slightly improve what you know will already work rather than go to a different part of the hypothesis space, completely wacky new design and try to make that work because everybody at the end of the day wants something successful, right? But now think if AI could understand all of these physics, all of this modeling in the virtual realm, and AI could also optimize the design. And to me, this is not just science fiction. We are seeing sparks of it. So at Caltech, we designed a novel medical catheter that reduced bacterial contamination 100-fold after going through lab experiments, but it was completely designed in the virtual realm, right? So the lab experiment was just to confirm that, yes, it did work as intended. And how was this possible? Because AI broadly understood what fluid dynamics looks like. So, if you're having fluid flow, bacteria tends to swim upstream, go into the human body. It's the most common healthcare related infection. So it's not just a theoretical problem. It's something that affects, right? Especially patients in long-term hospital visits. And so our idea was to design like triangular grooves inside the catheter and think about what would be the best way to disrupt the fluid flow, how to create the most amount of vortices and disrupt the bacteria swimming upstream. Again, a very simple concept in physics, but humans don't have the good intuition to say what is probably the right design because it's very nonlinear. So you'd rather have AI go and optimize that for you. And instead of going to the lab and doing trial and error, you minimize that and let AI come up with the better knowledge of physics, with the better knowledge of physics, the optimized design. We're doing that for nonlinear nanophotonics now, kind of like trying to design now ultimately better AI chips that would be very low power. And in a very nonlinear regimes, humans don't have a good intuition of how to put all of these components together, how to tune them, right? So AI can do very well. And now you reduce the cost of going to fabrication, trying out on physical devices. So ultimately, to me, the knowledge of physics is what is missing in AI. Of course, if you go ask ChatGPT, it gives, or I like Gemini DeepThink. All of them are good, not biased against one or the other, but they give wonderful answers, but they're still only giving that in textual form, right? What you really need is AI that can internally simulate and come up with like we did with the weather forecast, it simulates, it comes up with predictions, it comes up with something that's optimized. And so then it's something actionable. It's not just the theoretical concepts, it's an actual discovery.
That makes sense. And the way you've talked about this, everything you're talking about is cutting across disciplines, across data sets, universities. And so I wanted to ask you both about, starting with you, what you think about the state of collaboration in AI research right now, between the public sector and the private sector. I've heard it said by some of these private companies, this is the first technology that was developed primarily by the private sector. I'm sure Arati has opinions about.
I have opinions.
No. Me too.
After 50 years, it was an overnight success.
But beyond that, it's often said, and I know that in some ways this is a separate topic, but we're in this race of AI, US versus China or other countries. But as both of you have experienced, so much of these advances happen through international collaboration. And so curious, starting with you, if you could talk about the state of collaboration in AI research and the types of things that you think would be even more productive, the changes we could make.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, AI has always been an open source revolution, right? So my own story, I was in academia, I could work on all of this before industry, even thought was possible. So I went on the academic job market at the height of the previous recession in 2008. And, I couldn't dream of like going and working on AI in a company. And so academia is where we could nurture all of this, right? We did the scaling with ImageNet, all of that was in academia. And so even like, private labs, like I've been part of AWS and NVIDIA, and through that whole time, I've also been at Caltech. So I never left academia, but because to me, it was like, it's so important to continue that collaboration. Like the examples I gave of, coming up with neural operators and using that for scientific discovery, Caltech played such a big role because all of that core expertise of science is at Caltech, right? Industry cannot hire in every area. I mean, they're trying to, but again, sometimes I think the hype and like the pressure from Wall Street, everything sometimes distorts industry to overhype things, and we see that in a number of fields, and so academia is what keeps it real, because you're academia and open source, right, and nonprofits like the broader public labs, all of those, you're asking, okay, can you really prove this is true? And you see that happen every day. I mean, one day, like, the people claiming AI making discoveries, another day immediately they're like, oh, look, it was it was known before, it just wasn't, it was listed under open problems. People didn't know if it was open or not. So all of that requires open debate, open collaboration. And so to me, over until ChatGPT, there was a lot more openness in industry, right? And that's what concerns me, that there is not as much, because people think this has to be kept secret. This is really competitive. But that's why, like, you see DeepSeek come out of China have such a big impact, because, a lot of the foundations we built, they decided to build on that further. And of course, with lack of resources, they had to be even more inventive, and then they open sourced it. But a lot of, like, now US labs, US research uses those. So open source is a way that's it's an international collaboration, and science is an international collaboration. So we should make sure, the administration, both at state and federal level, should make sure that nothing comes in the way of open collaboration and open source.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And the thing I will add is I look at what's possible as you and others are driving AI for science. And to me, every area that you're working in is going to throw open another huge door for opportunities. And I'm really interested in how we get through the door to the other side and turn it into practical advances. And sometimes the issue is, we talked about the drug story, where if it's going to make a real change in the world, you have to change a critical regulatory process and speed it up and improve it. Other times it's a matter of reach or scale. And back in LLM land, educational tools for kids, like, I'm very confident we're going to have very good, capable tools, but we're just not doing anything about our fundamental problems until we can reach every child. So and some of the other areas you talked, this is adjacent to many of the things you talked about, but one of the AI aspirations that we looked at was about materials design. I grew up in the semiconductor area, and that's if you think about the materials to build the next generation chip, it's a nearly impossible problem, because you have to be able to define these small features. You have to have these multiple stacks of different materials. They have interfaces. I mean, it's a nightmare. And on top of that, there are incredibly dangerous environmental consequences from a lot of the materials that are used. So there are environmental and health concerns and safety concerns that go along with it. If we want semiconductor manufacturing, which we have finally started getting back in the US, if we want it to continue to thrive in the US, we have to turn the ability of AI to explore a much wider space of materials, to design materials with these seemingly impossible combinations of properties so that we can continue to thrive. That, to me, that ties directly to competitiveness and having an industrial revival be able to continue here in the US. So I just think in 10 or 15 years, maybe to come back to where you talked about that, Vivek, I want my kids to grow up in a time when they never have to worry about getting Alzheimer's because we have good treatments for it. That's literally unimaginable today, but that it might be possible for their generation. And there's so many other examples. That's what gives me hope. It's why I keep coming to work every morning. And I just think we have to be clear that we are not only are we not aggressively pursuing those opportunities, we are actually in the process of eroding and destroying the research base that makes all of these things possible to begin with.
And Arati, one more question for you on this. You talked about some of these policy changes. Clearly, and this was true when you were in the White House, or it remains true today, that if you poll the American people on AI, tend to be very skeptical, even somewhat frightened. And I haven't really seen much of a change in that over the last couple of years. And so I'm curious, both from your perch in DC and now where you are, where you've had a chance to step back and look at this, what do you think are the sources of that? Do you worry that that's going to get in the way of achieving the types of advances that you were just talking about? And what do you think that we could all do about that?
Yeah, I think it's striking to me how much more concern there is in the US. By the way, there's both enthusiasm and concern, but concern continues to slightly outweigh enthusiasm. And it's not like that in other parts of the world. And I think there's an important message in that. I see two things that have happened in the recent past in the US that are part of why we are where we are. One is the social media generation, the polarization that it has caused. And beyond that, the reality distortion that has destroyed a lot of kids' lives and lots of other people's lives as well. People are still reeling from the fact that we have not taken the steps we need to take on social media. And if you look at the displacement of workers through automation and manufacturing moving overseas, that's another crisis that we failed to deal with as a country. It hollowed out so many regions, it hollowed out so many jobs. And when people see AI coming now for more and more classes of jobs, I think it's a very reasonable reaction to be concerned about the employment impacts. So I think we got to this place of heightened concern. We earned it fair and square. And I think the only way it turns around is something that would be advantageous for society, but actually is important for companies. We have to win people's trust about this technology by behaving responsibly. And that includes having the legislation and the regulations and the enforcement to mitigate the harms that come, whether it's hollowing out jobs and displacing workers, whether it's embedding discrimination and AI is this amazing efficiency engine, but if we're going to use it to be efficient at discrimination and fraud, that is not the future we want to go to. So I think we need to listen when people are telling us that they're more concerned. We've got real work to do. That
makes sense. And Anima, you, of course, are at a leading university, conducting your own research, but also advising graduate students. And one of the parts of academia, of course, I'm sure it attracted you to academia is you get to pick the problems that you want to work on. So when you're advising students who are excited about AI, they want to put their skills to work, how do you channel them? Of course, a lot of them are getting pushes from industry to join them, to tweak some feature of one of these LLMs. What's the advice you generally give them about how to contribute to the types of problems that you've been able to work on?
Right. I mean, Caltech especially is a small university, right? And in academia with limited resources, you cannot afford to do everything. So you have to pick and choose, and you have to it's really the selection of the problem is the most important thing. And so questioning what is the impact if this were to be solved? How difficult is it? Of course, if it's impossible, then you're kind of wasting the time. At the same time, if everybody else is working on the same thing, then what is your unique contribution? Yeah, so one of the things I tell students is I'm not going to work on LLMs and see how they react. Of course, we do quite a bit of that work.
What do they say when you say that? What are their reactions?
Many are intrigued. I mean, they know that I work for AI for science more broadly, so they understand that, I may not be doing the same thing as OpenAI or some of the other companies are already doing, right? And if they have more scale and if you're just going to do the same exact algorithm, to me, how are you going to win? And I think many students see that there is now an ability to do this in many other areas and solve like these hardest scientific challenges. And so in a way, those who come to Caltech are already thinking about science. So it helps me, kind of there's already good alignment to begin with.
And then I'll ask you a final question, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience, which is that, Arati, you advised the president for several years. And I know you've met with so many policymakers as well. We were talking about Governor Newsom, who I also used to work for. And I think one thing that was so inspiring about this workshop is we had people, even in the workshop where I was in, we had Arati, we had a former policymaker from Homeland Security, we had a longtime leader at the Ford Foundation, we had a writer, so people from all walks of life. And so when you think about, both, I guess there's two questions in one here. If you could have that meeting again now with the governor, with the president in general, doesn't have to be the specific set of circumstances we're dealing with at this moment, but also the folks in this room who are working on this issue from so many different angles. What's the advice you would give that based on what you've seen on how to best contribute to the set of aspirations that we all want to make real?
Good. Go ahead.
I mean, to me, it's, kind of keeping in mind how AI has always been this open source revolution, right? And so much of research still needs to be done. It's not like, oh, it's solved because language models everybody can use, all of AI is solved. I think there's that kind of notion that a lot of people go about, as well as, oh, all of the work, important work is being done in the private sector. But it's always like academia that starts with the foundations. And especially when academia, when there are more limited resources, then you're looking at all these alternative approaches rather than going through the same journey as industry. So you want that diversity, right? This aspect of, oh, let 1,000 flowers bloom. That aspect is really important. And we're seeing less and less of that in the private sector because there's this mad rush. It's like, okay, I have to do the next launch. I really have to get there, right? And then that has different incentives than being able to say, let me broadly explore. Success is not assured, but, I want to try this. For instance, the power problem. We are talking about building these enormous data centers, but ultimately the physics of how small we can get these transistors to be, what power they consume, determines can we really scale AI to these massive scale, especially for AI for science, because when we are talking about language models, we've pretty much already, overcome all of the internet. We've used that. So any new data is getting generated, but much more slowly because there's only so much you can do. But if you think about scientific modeling, the knowledge of physics, you have to model the world in 4 dimensions, so 3 dimensions in time. And so even if you have like 1,000 grid points in each dimension, that's like a context length in hundreds of billions. So for those who know language models, Anthropic or anybody is like advertising, we have 1 million length context, but the real world around us has infinite context, right? So, and that cannot just be that same pure scaling, same kind of transformer architecture. It requires new thinking. It also requires thinking of, as I said, from the hardware side, how do I come up with either new semiconductors, new ways to connect, like optical interconnects. I was just last week at DC for the NSF workshop on hardware and AI. So it's really good that, we got this community to come together from different perspectives. But, we have to build for that. We have to build for that next problem, not just the current scaling.
I'd seen, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal last week, they asked the founder of an AI app, why are you doing this? And he said, these next 2 years are the last chance to build generational wealth, and then all the problems will be solved after that. So it looks like.
Good luck to him.
Yes. Arati, to
I'll
you.
start in a dark place, which is to point out that President Trump's budget proposal for the National Science Foundation cut it by over 50%. So I'm really glad you got that workshop. But I want to end at a much brighter place, because what I want people who are thinking about how to do these things and get on the right track with AI, I think we're in a time in our country that is so dark and so dangerous and so scary, in part because so many of us have forgotten what this country can do. But it is still true that we are doing astonishing things, and science and technology is a part of that. We all carry around something in our hands that was science fiction not that long ago. You can find out what the weather is, and you can know where you are anywhere in the world from a device that you carry in your hand. It's so normal now, but it was literally science fiction not that many years ago. I think about how we explore the floor of the ocean. I think about the fact that we sent a probe out that caught photons from the immediate aftermath of the Big Bang. I mean, it's unbelievable what we are able to do. And it happens because we come together and we decide that it doesn't matter if it seems impossible. It's so dazzling, and it's going to shape our future. And we've just rolled up our sleeves and done it. And it's not going to happen just by the private sector doing their thing. We need the universities. The federal support is vital to that foundation. We need the whole system working again. And I retain my optimism that we can get there, but we have a lot of work to do to get back on track.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of how some days in the White House, Arati, people are running around dealing with the crisis news story of the day. And occasionally she would send latest photos from the Mars rover or one of the telescopes, just to remind people there's a whole world out there and there are incredible things that we're doing. So we have some time for questions. Just state your name at the beginning and then ask your question. We'll start with you.
One second. I'm going to pass her in a mic. We are not amplifying, you might have noticed, but we are recording. And so I wanted you to know before you ask a question that we're recording, but I'm going to give the mic and walk it around the room as we ask questions.
Thank you. Loved the conversation. So Marcela Escobar, I'm one of the UC Berkeley Fellows. And so I have a question. You talked a little bit about the impacts of social media and children, right? So what's going to be the impact of AI and possibly the dumbifying or brain atrophy of critical thinking? Like, we all grew up with critical thinking skill sets. How do you foresee this affecting the next junior generation?
Do you want to dive in? I have thoughts, but I just had a really interesting dinner with a bunch of people who are much smarter than I am about kids and AI. And what I learned, and there was recently some Gallup polling on this where they spoke with students about AI. So the thing that was not surprising was they're using it. They are excited about it. But the thing that was surprising in the poll is that students are anxious about AI. And they are anxious because they don't know what the ground rules are. They're anxious because one student might be using it to do homework and the other isn't, and each one thinks that they're following the rules. And they are anxious because they're concerned about their critical skills, the critical thinking skills not developing. So that actually gave me a little hope that they knew to worry about that. I like that. I also think about I am enough of a fossil that it was in high school that I first saw an electronic calculator. And, we learned the slide rule when I was in high school, and a kid brought a calculator to class one day, and every adult said, "Oh, you won't be able to do math anymore if you rely on those things." And it's true. I can't do math anymore, but I don't mind relying on it. So that tempers my concern a little bit. And I still retain some optimism that we're going to figure out a way to be masters of the technology and use it to help us.
You over here. Next question.
Thank you. This is just fascinating. Your expertise in this realm is astounding, and it makes me pull together several different arenas. And I say, could AI optimize design for an economic model where all citizens are provided for in health, food resources, shelter, where the resources come from the uber wealthy in ways that don't threaten them and their luxury lives, such that they would agree with and support this new economic design.
Took the last one, Anima. I think that is AI for the hardest science of all, which is social science.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, AI can, of course, optimize once you tell what to optimize, right? And what are the constraints, but you still need to define for that. And ultimately it needs humans to agree together. So that's the difficult part to me.
We'll go to this side, you over here.
Hi, Leah Shanley at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley. One of the areas that I've been involved in is engaging public participation in scientific research. And we just hosted a workshop with the Computing Community Consortium on the role of convergence of citizen science or participatory sciences and AI and computing. So what do you see, particularly you were talking about in medicine, for example, the potential for human AI teaming with the American public, where we can get 1 million or 2 million participants contributing data and expertise and partnering with AI on that.
No, absolutely. Data is the key, right? And so collecting data in the right way, like, of course, ethical and with all of the, IRB or whatever it is, that a modern version of it if necessary. So you want to make sure that we collect the data and then pass on those benefits to the people. So to give you an example, at the height of the pandemic, we trained an AI model that was based on all the known genomes of virus and bacteria, right? So in this case, it's not humans, but every viral and bacterial strand that has been collected, all of its mutations in every disease, right? Or even those that are friendly bacteria. So it's about 110 million genomes or so. So what was the point of this? Now, once you have this kind of foundation model, instead of understanding English language, it understands the language of genomes. And in this case, we could then fine tune on coronavirus, which at that time, we all know what the world was going through. We wanted to ask what are the new variants of concern that may emerge without, and be prepared beforehand. And so these kind of abilities of like having, instead of trying to figure out what coronavirus in particular is going to do, where it's going to mutate, which is very difficult, you look at the overall patterns across all the virus and bacteria, you have more of that ability to do these evolutionary predictions. And same with humans. I mean, the human data is so limited. And this is where China has an advantage because they can collect data at scale and they're doing that. And they are, right, like using that for a lot of target discovery and so on. And here this is where the government has to kind of take the leadership to say, how can we collect in a way that is really meaningful, and we can then do very valuable research on it.
Hi, thank you again. I'm Marcus. I'm an undergraduate here at Cal, and I had a bit more of a policy question about liability. And you mentioned social media and how Section 230 has really prevented social media companies from being regulated. So I'm curious if you see that applying to AI, but also the kind of ambiguous responsibility, whether the lab that created the foundational model is responsible, whether the site hosting it is, whether the user themselves is responsible for the prompting. And obviously this question is kind of LLM specific, but also just broader in kind of AI models writ large. So how the Biden administration was considering the liability question, and also how we're just looking at it more broadly today.
So I'll start, but I think Vivek you have to do some work besides just asking questions, Vivek, and you're going to have a good thing to say. I want to start by pushing on the premise of your question. I think we have to stop talking about AI as the model. That is the Sam Altman model of AI. It is the Dario Amodei model of AI. It's not actually how AI works. And of course, that's their model because that's their business model, but it's not how AI works. And if you think about AI as software, that it's a thing that's going to be in everything, then I think you can start thinking in some more practical ways about things like liability. And the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of things that we don't want AI systems to enable are already illegal. And a lot of the job is figuring out how to regulate, enforce, even insure against those kinds of harms. So I want to sort of break that model of I don't think the world is driven by those foundation models, despite the fact that the creators of the foundation models only talk about it that way.
Oh yeah, that makes sense, but it's a very good question. I know we thought a lot about it when we were in DC, and folks continue to think about it now. I would just say two things very briefly about it. Number one, which Anima mentioned, these LLMs in particular have been created, like you mentioned, with all the data on the internet. And so, that is the product of, millions of people, their intellectual work, their decisions. And so there is a sense that people should be compensated for that. And we're starting to see some legal settlements, but they tend to be one-offs. And you want to think through what would be an actual model where people, we talked about music in our workshop, are actually compensated for the work that they are doing, and not just seen as an input into this LLM where someone else is capturing all the value. It's true for journalism as well. And then the second thing is with liability, it's always tricky because if you clamp down too hard, then you shut down the activity in question. But then if you say, well, anything goes, then anything goes. And I think one of the reasons, to Arpi's point, people are skeptical is that, with social media, the Congress has basically not passed, if I'm correct, any sort of meaningful tech regulation since the 1990s. So we're basically looking at 30 years without meaningful federal regulation. And you're starting to see some bipartisan pushback to that when there was this preemption of state laws that Ted Cruz proposed in the Senate. You had everybody from the most liberal members to Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, we can't deal with this. And so there's no easy answer to this, but if you can create, people talk about a safe harbor, but one thing that I've been thinking about and talking with Arti about and some others is if you can create a safe harbor where when people meet that target, it means, yes, I can't prevent every single possible harm because all products out there in the world have harm, but they meet a standard of care, which ultimately is what liability is about. Then we can certify this, in this case, an LLM, but any of these products has met a standard the same way that you don't put a car out into the world or even a bicycle helmet before it's undergone some type of testing. And so, of course, then the question is really in the details. How do we make sure that process is not captured by industry? And I think that's where all of us in this room come in to try to shape that. Yes, you in the back over there.
Hi, I'm Yongkit. I'm from Singapore. I studied quantum mechanics. I enjoyed your talk, and my last job was at Singapore's Government Technology Agency. We're trying to scale up AI applications for the public service. So one of the things we've noticed back in our country is that the whole hype of generative AI, it's based on some emergent property of, how, when you increase the amount of compute, you get this kind of reasoning, right? It's a property. But for a huge portion of AI history, for those of us who have been in, I guess, Singapore, in the academia, we couldn't help but notice that a lot of AI development was based on parsimonious AI or smart AI that didn't necessarily require so much compute and so much resources. So my question, therefore, is whether you think that the value of parsimonious AI and research has been undermined by the recent hype of generative AI. And if you think there is, what do you think we can do as governments, countries, academia, and I guess partners to really shift the conversation back to where AI originally used to be, because the current trajectory seems to be really resource intensive. So as a foreigner, I just thought to ask your views. Thank you.
I mean, a lot of research continues, right? So just because it doesn't get talked about on Twitter as much or goes viral doesn't mean it's not happening. So, a lot of research, especially in academia, when we don't have as much compute, then we are forced to think about techniques on how to reduce the power requirements, how to make these algorithms smarter and better. In fact, even back in 2018, some of the work I was doing was this kind of hardware, software co-design. How do you design algorithms that train these models better because you know there are hardware constraints, you want to save energy, and that was never the original goal, right? When optimization was done in the 70s and 80s, there was no notion of saving on hardware energy because that wasn't one of the constraints. But now we are in this new world. So there's a lot of foundations being built on how to do this in a principled way. So you reimagine how AI works itself, both at training, at an inference. How do you reduce precision? How do you require less parameters and still be able to do the same job? And so there's some very deep questions in optimization to enable this. And, so that continues to happen. But at the same time, if you see like edge devices, we are now putting AI on a drone, right? How can it fly in very dangerous high wind conditions? We also have the experimental facility at Caltech where we have a fan array where we can simulate those kinds of conditions. And then you need edge AI. It cannot be this massive AI model. And so all of these research continues to happen. So, and in a way, like also, other countries like China, where computing has been more limited, have also been incentivized. So the incentives are there, but of course, more funding would certainly improve these. And it also happens at the level of the semiconductor and hardware design itself. Like if we can reduce power requirements, a lot has been said about the brain versus the GPU, right? Several orders of magnitude difference.
25 watts.
Yes, it's a long way to go.
All right, we have time for two more.
We have one more question from the host, because I think we need this to close it out. So Arati, you started out bigger, better ambitions, public missions, real problems that would have great impact on individuals in this country, individuals globally. Anima, you talked about data and the importance of data. You were talking about weather data, publicly produced, often weather data. Arati talked about R&D. Vivek, you talked about kind of the open, inclusive innovation system across the public and private sector. At a time when we're seeing cuts to research, we're seeing gutting of technical talent from the government, reductions in the availability of public data, attacks on open communications, freedom of expression within universities. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about kind of the intersection of those issues and what they mean for our ability to actually tap into AI's transformative potentials.
We have a problem today. And if we have got to stop the crisis, because the opportunities, if we can get back on track, are just too compelling to ignore. And right now we're serving it up on a silver platter for the rest of the world. Not a good move.
I mean, to me at Caltech, we continue on this mission, and this is a mission that is, been like the guiding light for me, like how to bring, young people, especially, we want to make sure the pipeline of students, postdocs continues, and they get on to, not only many of them work in these private sector, right? But many are also back in academia, and that's how we continue that. So to me, it's that aspect of training the next generation that really motivates me to continue this.
Thank you, Deirdre and Dan, for hosting us, and thanks for both of our panelists.
Thanks.